All here. I think some of us, there's a few people in here, faces that may not be familiar. Some of you may not know everyone here. Let's do a quick go around, starting with the very famous Gary McDowell.
Give me the $20. Gary McDowell, Jepson.
Tom Marin, Jepson.
Crystal Hoyt, Jepson. Amy Tripp, Jepson.
I'm going to be the oddball right off the bat. My name is Jamie Stewart. I'm actually with Regent University.
Oh.
I'm a master's student in organizational leadership there. I was actually in town visiting, and my ex-husband works in safety and security here at U of R.
Oh.
And said, hey, there's this great lecture since you're studying leadership. You may be interested in checking it out. So I'm the oddball.
Wow.
So.
Well, welcome. That's great.
Terry Price, Jepson.
Sandra Beard, Jepson.
Al Kofels, Jepson.
Gil Hickman, Jepson.
Yes, you are, and certainly a great student. And you've come to our seminars that we've had, our international cafes. Yeah, well, welcome. And you're from Poland?
No, Bulgaria.
Bulgaria, right, Bulgaria.
Doug Hicks, Jepson.
Peter Kaufman, Jepson and Odd.
Sue Murphy, Jepson. Nancy Knox, Jepson.
Rihanna Gabbard, Knox, Jepson.
Carol Weinstein, everything.
Steve Allred, not Jepson, Brothers.
Okay, and I'm Joanne Shula, and Hugh Liebert, and what do we call you? Hugh, come sit down.
You come and sit.
Yeah, come sit
Chair
nearby.
with me.
These chairs are more comfortable anyway.
Did you
And
know
Hugh
how
Liebert
it
is
is?
working with Gary McDowell at the Marshall Center. So anyway, welcome to all of you, and I am so pleased to have you here, and I'm really pleased to have our Fulbright scholar, Ruth Capriles, with us. Ruth and I still can't remember how many years ago we met, but we know it's over 20 years ago when I was doing some work in Venezuela. Ruth is, I'm going to give you the personal view of her instead of the CV view of her. Well, she works primarily at, she's a little worried now, at Andreas Bellos Catholic University in Caracas. And Ruth has done some extraordinary work in Venezuela. She is, I guess, generally, do you call yourself a political scientist? I think that's pretty, a political theorist and a philosopher.
Scientist, I don't know.
Well, a political something. And Ruth, one thing you can say about Ruth is she is very political. One of her accomplishments was that many years ago she put together a dictionary of corruption, which chronicled all the corruption scandals in Venezuelan history. And this was a project, Ruth has done work in business ethics, which is my other field. It's a project that got her in a lot of trouble.
For which I am sorry now.
Oh, you're sorry? No, I find that hard to believe. But part of the impetus for this, which I think is really wonderful, is to lay out all the kinds of corruption that they have seen in government and business to sort of understand, what needs to be done in society. So Ruth was responsible for that. She has also been very active as a journalist, writing articles, particularly agitating articles against Chavez. She worked with a group called Vidores, and this was the Watchers, is that the correct translation? And this is a group of people all over Venezuela who basically keep an eye on what Chavez has been doing. And she coordinated something called the Net. Is it called the Net? Yeah, which was the internet, which was information on the things that Chavez has been doing. I have to say, over the years that I've known Ruth, she's told me things about Chavez's activities, for example, working with the Colombian rebels, that don't appear in our newspapers for quite a while after. And so she's had an extraordinary insight as a political activist, as a journalist, and as an academic. She's written a number of books. She just published a book on Hugo Chavez, and we're very fortunate to have her with us to talk about the research that she'll be doing while she's here. She's writing a book for one of my series on leadership by resentment. So I turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ruth Capriles.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Anne. And thank you all for being here. It's an honor for me. And it's really, I am sure it will be an enriching meeting for me, because I really need lots of feedback about my work. So I really thank you for being so willing to listen to this not very nice subject matter. I intend to first go over the definition of resentment. My book will be called Leadership by Ressentiment, as they say in French. And I plan here to give you some, to present here the kind of a model I have drawn for the theoretical work on ressentiment. And then I'll try to explain these little slides or illustrations, which, well, to save space, they're a little small, but I hope that you can read it. Anyway, and then I will very fast, very lightly apply it to Venezuelan present historical process. I won't delve too long on that, I hope. And then I hope to have time to make some reflections on what can we do in front of this kind of destructive process which resentment really produces. So first, a word about my sources. There are two good things and one bad thing about theoretical work on resentment. The first good thing is that there are not many works on resentment, so we don't have to read too much. That's a good thing. I mean, Nietzsche, who said it all, and he really was interested on the historical perspective on resentment, and I think made in that genealogy of morals what I now understand as a phenomenology of power. Scheller, who tried, or maybe did, do it, a phenomenology of the sociology of resentment, of ressentiment. Gregorio Marañón is a Spanish psychiatrist who delved in the psychological aspects of the phenomenon and also applied it to, in the biography of Tiberius, applied it to the men in power, to the leaders and that are resented. And Manuel García Pelayo, who is very dear in Venezuela and in Spain. He's been a very important person in Spain and in Venezuela. He was the founder of political studies in Venezuela. And he didn't publish, he wrote and posthumously was published a little commentary on Scheller, but in that little piece he insisted on the importance of resentment for leadership and for political science. So, and the publication of that little piece was, in a way, the starting point of my research and maybe any research that is been doing now in Venezuela about the problem. The second good thing about these works, of course, there are many other authors I should mention, von Mises, Sombart, Weber, many other authors mention or use ressentiment to apply it as a category to understand either economic or social behavior, etc. But they don't make contributions, theoretical contributions to the phenomenon. They just used it or mention it. And of course, literature has hundreds of characters, resented, characters, which are very instructive, and some of those works, of course, I have read, and they have been useful for this, and so on, so on. But these four works really make it. The second thing about this short literature is that there is a general agreement on the definition, the characterization, and the diagnosis of the phenomenon, which is, as you know, just a heaven's gift, because whenever one studies something, one have to, compare like 300 definitions and so on. Well, here you don't have any problem because everyone agrees on the description of the phenomenon. The bad thing about it, about that literature, is that they all agree also that ressentiment is an incurable disease, on which I will be bold enough to disagree later on. Anyway, let's have a definition, a common definition of resentment. Both Scheller and Nietzsche say that the word ressentiment refers to a kind of brooding emotion. Scheller says that Nietzsche made it a terminus technicus, which has no equivalent in the German language, and that's why Nietzsche uses the French word. Scheller uses the French word, and all translation of Nietzsche and Scheller into English also use the French word ressentiment. That's why we are keeping it in English. Not in Spanish, by the way. In Spanish, we have a word, resentimiento, which is exactly the same as in French. So in Spanish, usually Spaniards use the Spanish spelling. Well, the definition, it is an emotion that consists in a repeated experience of negative, hostile feelings, like anger or envy, which have been repressed under the condition of impotence. It is a reliving of the original emotional response to some initial act of aggression or situation of disadvantage. And after several stages of repression, the hostile feelings sink into the personality and escape the control of reason and or will. So we can go to the little slides here. The first slide, this is what I've been trying is usually all authors are not very systematic in treating the problem. So what I have tried is to make a tool that is appropriate to be applied to the study of a historical or practical situation. And that's why I have done these little illustrations. The first one, in the top left, is refers to individual or psychological ressentiment. That's the point of start. That's where all authors start from, because they know this is an emotion, thereby it is a psychological problem. So they all, even Nietzsche, Scheller, all of them start from a psychological definition or characterization of the problem, and then they will go to other levels, social, political, etc. So the thing is, the process of ressentiment goes like this. The first input or the first original event is an original aggression or an original situation of disadvantage. If the person who receives that aggression is powerful, is potent, will return the aggression, will counter aggression, and then the emotion is solved. And we have the typical model of a stimulus response complete. The response goes to the direct object of the emotion, goes back to the provoker of that emotion. But if the person is not powerful, feels impotent, is a matter of feeling impotent, is relative, is objective impotence, okay? If the person feels impotent, then will repress. That's the first repression, the first stage. And will wait for a second moment to turn back on the aggressor. If the person later on feels potent enough to get revenge, and gets revenge, again, the emotion is resolved. And again, a stimulus response goes to the direct object of the emotion. But if at the second moment, this second occasion, the person keeps on being impotent, a second repression occurs, and then it happens that all emotions sink deep, that they are very insistent on this. Scheller and Marañón, from the psychological point of view, it sinks into the personality so much that then escapes reason, control, even consciousness. The person may not know that he has anger and envy or aggression inside him. He may not even realize he's got it, but it is there. It's sunk deep into the personality. From there on is ressentiment, and then is done. I mean, no cure for that. Is sunk into the personality, and it will come out. It will. I mean, there will be expressions of that emotion, of that hidden emotions, and all those expressions of the hidden emotions are negative, hostile, and destructive. The person cannot but destruct. The arrows that way and the arrow that way are seeking to mean that this is a progress of feeling. Of course, this is a simplified version. They usually talk about a progression of feelings, and it can be very long. For example, Scheller talks about a progression that goes from anger, revenge, rancor, envy, impulse to detract, spite, schadenfreude, and finally, malice. And of course, in Nietzsche, it will be revolt. Anyway, there is a progression of feeling. There is a progression of feeling in the repressions, but there is also a progression in the intensity of the expression of those emotions. To use an example of the fox and the grapes, for example, the fox will say first that the grapes are sour, but then he will say that the grapes are not good for foxes, and then he will say that grapes are good for no one, and lastly he will say that we have to destroy all grapes and vines. That's what's happening in Venezuela, by the way, exactly so. So there is a progression in the expression of the feelings. I mean, the resented person will progressively get more and more aggressive and hostile, etc., etc. So those outputs are more or less a resume. You have. It's very important that in that process, one of the important thing is that the person starts to invert values. And one sign, a characteristic of the resented person is that inverts. There is an inversion of value. What was good before becomes bad, what was bad becomes good. We'll see more of that later on. I have considered very important, so especially at the psychological and individual level, to separate two processes, one that goes through aggression, anger, revenge, etc., and one that goes through envy and etc. The authors are not very clear about this. Scheller says that one source is envy and another source is anger. But then when he talks about the progression of feelings, he joins them. And it is true at the sociological level, usually, there is only one process. But at the psychological level, I think they are different. Because we see people that never go through envy. They have received an aggression, and they can get resented without being envious of anyone. And contrary or the same, someone can live in a situation of disadvantage, even if that is not an aggression, a specific aggression, and then you go through envy, through resentment. So they, especially at the psychological level, they can be different paths. Although many times you have aggression, anger, envy. I mean, you can have a longer process thereby. I realized that. And when I read a book which really sort of stopped me short for several months when I was writing my book, because it was heartbreaking, it was so beautiful, it was a testimonial of resentment. That's the most beautiful thing I have read about the Holocaust, which is the book by Jean Améry. That if you haven't read it, you should read it, because that's really déchirant, as they would say in French. And And he stopped me short because I realized that here I was thinking about the bad guys at home, you know, that I was watching on TV and doing bad things and destruction and all that. And suddenly I encountered a guy who was a good guy, who was a victim of the Holocaust, who never did any wrong in his life, who never wanted to destroy anything, who never was slandering, or, I mean, he did, and yet he was confessing to resentment. And I really realized that this guy wasn't, I mean, he wasn't envious. I couldn't join him with the envious people. And then it didn't fit into the usual definitions of resentment, because they all speak about hostile feelings towards other people, until I realized that I had to make that little amendment into the definition, because hostile feelings can go towards others or towards oneself. Jean-Améry changed his name, by the way, it's his German name, committed suicide, finally. And so I couldn't start, I mean, after I processed that, I realized I had to make some amendments to the standard literature, but also to make the difference of different process, etc., etc. The second slide, social resentment, is more or less like the first. I won't go into it because I don't think I have that much time. But I think it is important to just to say that when we are talking about social resentment, we are talking about a phenomenon that cannot be reduced, as you know, to the psychological level. And the authors usually don't make that difference, Nietzsche or Scheller or Garcia Pelayo, because as it is an emotion, well, they all start explaining the psychological aspects of the phenomenon. And then they jump to the sociological aspects, but I think we have to make a difference, and if we are going to study a society, and if we are going to say that a society is resented, we have to see that the inputs are different. I mean, the aggressions are collective aggressions, like conquest or wars, or that kind of inputs. It's not a personal aggression. When we're talking about envy, we're talking about inequality and social situations of disadvantage. And also when we're talking about the outputs, they will be a difference. They will be collective outputs, so we will be talking about mass behavior and not individual behavior. So that slide is especially to remind us that when we're talking about that, it's a different level of analysis. The third slide, which is my field in a way, political and historical dimension, is really what Nietzsche was talking about in the genealogy of morals. As you all know, in that book, Nietzsche tries to discover the origin of morality. And that's why genealogy of morality. And so he says there that morality is really the values of the strong, of the masters, of the nobles, of the warriors, of the conquerors. Call them as you wish. He even tells us, call them as you wish. The ruling class, I would call it these days, okay? So he says that, I mean, what's good is what describes the values or the qualities of the strong, and that's what is good. And he makes a reduction, so that's why we can say that he's applying a phenomenological method, even if we can, I mean, before Husserl, in a way. He makes a linguistic reduction, as you know, from bonus to duonus, to prove that the word good really means master or dominion or I mean, morality reduces to power, in a simple way to say it. So these strong people say what is good, and these values, this is very important, these values are positive. They are affirmative values of themselves. I mean, they are not comparing to anyone else. They are just saying, what I am, that's what is good. That's what is good. So what is evil, by the way, is different. It's not what the good ones, what the masters say. The masters don't define evil. The masters define good, because good is what they are. And the rest, can be despicable. Despicable, but it's not evil. That's very, anyway, that is dominant morality. And the slaves and the serfs and the rest of the people accept that morality because they are gregarious, because people usually are used to obey, because they simply obey. And that's their scale of values. That's the dominant morality. He says, but so it happens that there are a few that belong to the ruling class, that belong to these warriors and conquerors, but they are not as strong as the real rulers. They are weak because they are cowards. They don't want to war. They don't want to go to war. They are cowards and they are weak, and so they cannot be as the good ones, the nobles and the conquerors, so they are the ones that get resented. So those are the ones that will eventually revolt, because slaves don't revolt. So that's a little paradoxical that he calls the revolt of the slaves, when in reality he says himself that the slaves don't revolt, but it is the minority faction. And that's when he says that the priests, the Jewish priests, and also Christ, especially Christ, because he says that Christ is the first great resented in history of humanity, that those are the resented ones, and they will revolt. How they will revolt? They will invert values. And there is something very important that he says here, and I think that in leadership studies we should really put our thinking onto it, is that he says that how do they do it? How do they revolt? Well, they distort the political concept of dominion, of power, and they convert it, they make it a psychological concept. So the priests tell the slaves, you are the ones, you are the beautiful, you are, being poor is good, suffering is good, and you are the ones that will be received in the realm of God. But that's a spiritual or a psychological lie, in a way, or way to dominate. Instead of recognizing as the strong ones, the warriors did, that they say, well, look, I am the strong, and that's why I'm mastering you. No, the priests, he says, make this distortion of a political concept into a psychological concept, and that's the way how. So they appeal to the slaves and they tell them this, and also another way how they master is that they instill or undermine the dominant morality or the ruling class by lies, malice, slander, and all devious ways that the resented use to undermine the legitimacy of the rulers. Until the time, Nietzsche says, when the rulers start feeling guilty about their right to rule, then is when the revolt starts. So now we see that in reality we have more than one condition. It's not only the impotence of the masses, the only condition for resentment, at least for the revolt to happen, but we have three conditions. We have the impotence of the majority, the potency of a minority faction, because evidently if they revolt and take power, they have to have some potency. And three, the loss of rulers' consciousness. It's bad, what Nietzsche called bad consciousness, the bad consciousness. So once they revolt, they will invert values and dominate by negations of values. And so we live in the realm of resentment. And there is when one has to start questioning Nietzsche what happens afterwards. what happens after revolt. He says that the revolt of the Jew-Christian civilization has lasted for more than 2,000 years. And that was at the end of the 19th century, so we have 10 more years, 100 more years. So if that is so, one has to start doubting Nietzsche, because, I mean, Judeo-Christian civilization, as I understand it, has been the most creative civilization in the world, or that we know of, I mean, at least in present history. So somewhere along the road, the resented had to start creating good, positive values and all that, and not being distracted. But no, he says that they cannot create good, positive values. It will always be destruction and negative values. Scheller, that's the fourth slide, in a way helps us, because when he wants to do the phenomenology of resentment, he posits what he calls a sociological law. He says that ressentiment is related to the discrepancy between political, constitutional, or traditional status and factual power. Sorry. So he says, in closed societies, this discrepancy doesn't exist. People don't expect, they don't get resented. In open society like ours, he says, there is where resentment happens. Because what people expect, because there is a big discrepancy between what people expect and what they are getting as factual power. So this is very interesting. I mean, I think the law is an interesting tool to understand society. And of course, it's a way of expressing, of measuring the impotence of several classes, the impotence of the majority, and also the probability of getting a revolt. But it doesn't help us much more, at least in Scheller's book, because in a way, Scheller is more pessimistic than Nietzsche. Nietzsche at least believed that Superman would come and solve everything. But Scheller ends with decay. And it is interesting that Scheller doesn't give so much importance to revolt. He seems to think that resentment will come out progressively out of the inversion of values, and that's what he studies. Because what he tries is to convince us, to show, which I think he does, that it wasn't the Jews and it wasn't Christ who were resented, but it's modernity, it's bourgeoisie, modernity, the industrial society, the values of technology, the modern values of technology. That's the inversion of values. So facing that inversion of values in modernity, we only have decay, and that's his last word, decay. So we are doomed, according to Scheller, even more than with Nietzsche. So that's more or less what they say. Before going to the last two slides, in which I try to open the alternatives and try to come out of the vicious circle that they left us, I want to apply this model fast to Venezuelan history. Just highlights of the model. If we apply this model to Venezuelan history, we see that it fits perfectly, and I suppose it fits in many other places. If we think about the original input or act of aggression, I would say that 1959 to 1967 is the original event of aggression in Venezuela. Why? In 1958, many popular uprising, military, everyone united to depose a dictator in Venezuela. So in 1959, an agreement was signed between all parties and all sectors in Venezuela. It was called the Pact of Punto Fijo. If you ever listen to Chavez, you will hear him say that that was the axis of evil. Nevertheless, it was beautiful, ample, multi-party, multi-class, multi-sector pact signed between everyone except the Communist Party, which was a mistake, it seems. But in the signing of that pact, peasants, workers, church, military, businessmen, merchants, all the parties, Christian, left, center, everyone was invited and everyone was there. That's what is called in Venezuela, according to Juan Carlos Rey, a writer on our populist model, is the Populist Coalition. And it worked. It allows Venezuela to have almost 50 years of democracy, a stable democracy, alternating governments, and a modernized society. It was really a working in a multi-sector coalition. It was costly at the beginning. Our first democratic president, Rómulo Betancourt, who now I have to recognize, he was really a great statement. He had to suffer to pull this through. He had to live and maintain, consolidate, and institutionalize our democracy through guerrilla warfare, 4 coups d'etat, 2 of them in an alliance of military and communists, which were ideological, who justified among the radical left at the moment. One assassination attempt by ordered by Trujillo, the dictator of Dominican Republica. One invasion, it was called an invasion of Machurucuto, which I think is nice enough, which is called an invasion. In truth, were 12 guys from Cuba in 2 rafts full of arms, and they were coming to go into the mountains through the beach of Machurucuto. That's why it is called so, but it is very important that you know about it. And anyway, they were going to go into the mountains too because they were going to train the guerrilla fighters in Venezuela. That's 1967. That's why that's the last, that's the date, the last date I chose. And this event is quite meaningful, and I found how meaningful it is when I started reading the testimonials of the guys that had got into power with Chavez, and I realized that they were remembered that event. So it's very important. And why it is important? Well, because of 12 guys, they killed 10. And it was difficult. It wasn't easy because they were really well armed, and they spent the whole night fighting with the army. The army were tipped off by a fisherman that saw them in the night, so it was mere luck for Betancourt. And then they killed the 10 guys, and they grabbed 2 prisoners, and with those prisoners and the arms, they went to the American Organization of States. And that was a proof that Fidel Castro was interfering in the region's affair, and that was a proof why Fidel Castro and Cuba were expelled from the OAS until recently. I mean, Betancourt was the one that got Cuba expelled from the Organization of American States. So and that was the end of Venezuelan guerrilla. That meant the end in a way. So, but that's the wound that never healed, in a way. So that's the original aggression and input. What about the resented faction? At the end of the 60s, after this happened, the new governments, Leone was the second president, and then Rafael Caldera was the third president, Well, they decided that the guerrilla times were over, so they called a pacification policy. All guerrilla fighters and the communists who had been expelled from power could come into civilian and political life, and they did. And since then, they ran into elections, they got seats at Congress, they even got power at the executive, and they participated from the 70s in decisions in power. They even had pivotal power in Congress, very important pivotal power, and well, they were popular among the students, and they had several political parties, and we were very happy that we were all together and that we didn't have the bad luck of Colombia and Peru and so on, that they have guerrilla and we didn't. We didn't know we would pay for that. But that's the equivalent of Nietzsche's priest. I mean, that's the resented minority. The impotence of the majority. I don't know if I have much time, so I'll be running. During 20 years, Venezuela bloomed into a beautiful democracy, and we have lots of resources, so we were on the way to modernity and to development. We were classified, and we were very happy with that, very proud that we were classified as the countries on the way to development. We were not third world, we were not underdeveloped, no, we were on the way to develop. Anyway, during 20 years, everyone had the opportunity. Don't believe Chavez that he said they didn't. No, everyone had opportunity, everyone could go to university, had health benefits, everyone had money everywhere, would go abroad, travel, everyone had opportunities, and really Venezuela was on good, on good tracks. But by the end of the 70s, the debt crisis that got us all, all developing countries suffered the same crisis. During the 70s, our governments had contracted heavy debts with US banks, especially to finance development projects, to develop resources different to oil, because we had many other resources, so they wanted to develop other resources. So they contracted heavy debts. When the Federal Reserve let flow the dollar and the interest rates rocketed, our debt doubled in 2 years, from 79 to 81, our debt. And then it was all downwards. Our governments were really didn't handle it well. They were corrupt, and they were certainly inefficient in the handling of the adjustment packages, and so that it really destroyed the legitimacy and the belief of the people that this was an open society. For the majority, the society opened. I mean, we were used to an open society. Everyone could rise, go up, and get all benefits. And suddenly they were saying, hey, it's not like that. Resources are scarce, and believe it or not, 1982 was the first time in 500 years in Venezuela that we heard that resources were scarce. I mean, I'm telling you the truth. Out of research of my own, we thought that resources were limitless. And someone in 1982, the economists that were visionary in those days, say, no, resources are scarce. And people didn't want to accept it. And during 10 years, no one accepted it. Anyway, so suddenly people said, no, it's closed society. So the discrepancy, which Scheller mentioned, happened at the end of, in the 80s. Finally, the loss of consciousness of the ruling class. I think that the contradictions between the neoliberal, as we call the neoclassical adjustments applied to our economies, really made the bad consciousness of our leaders. Because Carlos Andrés Pérez, who was our last democratic president, and who was ousted of power, and that's why we are where we are, he was a populist at heart. I mean, he was a populist at heart, but then he had these yes boys, as we call them, these economists, pro-Chicago adjustments and FM, the monetary fund. I mean, they were right, but but you know, they were unpopular, so making these adjustments, and there was a contradiction, a big contradiction there that made Carlos Andrés Pérez and made all the ruling class feel guilty of what was happening, because they didn't want to make those adjustments, yet they had to do them. And also all social indicators were going down, and also the ruling class was corrupt. So it was really bad. And also, so they lost their consciousness. I mean, their confidence on their right to rule, which is the importance of the bad consciousness. The bad consciousness really means that the rulers lose their confidence on their right to lead. So that's what happened. And of course, the resented faction had much to do in what happened, because that's why Scheller and Nietzsche say that the resented will be insidious, will undermine the ruler's consciousness and the ruler's legitimacy by lies and slander and all that. Well, that's what they did in Venezuela. In 1989, there was a popular uprising that was tremendous for Carlos Andrés Pérez, because he couldn't believe that the people were against him. And we all know, we all thought at the moment that that wasn't a spontaneous event. And it was recently that I found out that it wasn't spontaneous, that was really provoked by the radical left. And I knew it because in these last 10 years, you know, when you joined your enemy many times, well, some leaders from the radical right that were against Chavez in the last years told me that they were the ones that did it. I mean, and they told me the whole story. So I know they did it. And the military had something to do with that also. And finally, what they did, the trial to Carlos Andrés Pérez, our last president, for corruption, which for something that wasn't really corruption, and believe me, I can say, because I wrote about the corruption of that guy, but nevertheless, there was no corruption in that. He was just helping Nicaragua and Violeta Chamorro to bring out her electoral process. So anyway, he was blamed of corruption, and he was ousted of power, and that was done really by 3 people that were obviously had some, you know, that were sworn enemies of Pérez, of Carlos Andrés Pérez. So I think the loss of consciousness of the ruling class happened in the last 10 years, and that is the other condition why the revolt came when Chavez came into power in 1998 by the popular vote. As you know, he had tried to get into power by a coup d'etat in 1992, but he failed. We can talk about that later. I'll tell you the inside story of that. And it's all there, by the way. But let's quickly go over the last 2 slides. So after this happens, what can we do? Slide number 5 tries to open the alternatives of society. If we have a Scheller's law, the discrepancy between political, constitutional, or traditional status and factual power, and we take that as a measure of what is happening in society, and if we focus on conditions, then we could avoid the revolt of the resented by, you know, paying attention to those conditions. It is obvious that we have a great impotence of the majority. We have a decrease in the consciousness of rulers, or in the rulers' confidence of the right to lead. And we have a faction, a leadership from a resented minority, then we'll have the revolt of the resented. But if we have less impotence of the majority, we have a strong confidence of the rulers of the right to lead, because they are real representatives of their constituencies, etc., etc. And we have inclusions. We include the leaders of the minorities. Maybe we could go towards what Dahl calls polyarchy. And so the others are possibilities, of course, of variations on those conditions. And finally, what about after revolt? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what's going to become of Venezuela. But it is obvious that we have to say to Nietzsche and to Scheller and to all of them that, you know, destruction is not the only alternative after that revolt, that somehow along the way the resented, either the resented go out of the picture or the resented become creative. So we have to think that after the revolt there are at least two alternatives, one destruction, another construction. Destruction will lead inevitably to resentment again or to submission, which I think is the case of Cuba. Cuba is obviously under submission, or they have the alternative of construction, participation, and plurality. To conclude, I just want to say that I disagree with the two tenets of both Scheller and Nietzsche. One is the time span of the phenomenon. I don't think this is a phenomenon of longue durée, as the French would say. I think this phenomenon is this has this time span of the lives of the individuals that make the history. When I chose 1959 to 1967, I didn't choose it because I wanted to prove my point, but because that's this dates that comes out from all testimonials, documents I have read of the Chavistas and the people that revolted in 92, that brought the coup in 1992, etc. That's the wound that doesn't heal. That's the wound they remember and they bring out. I don't think all the Jews are resented because they were enslaved by the Egyptians, or all the Christians because they were persecuted by the Romans, or I don't think this revolt has to do with the Spaniard conquest and the colonial times, as V.S. Naipaul, a novelist I love, but that's what he has us believe, that, you know, we people from the South are all resented people because we were colonized. That's what Paul says, in a way. So I don't think that's true. And even if we have to accept that some parents transmit to their children their resentment, I don't believe that those children will be resented if conditions for them are changed. So I don't think that the span is the longue durée, even if many times, believe me, I know that I have to accept that there are signs into the contrary. For example, in Venezuela once, in Caracas, once the followers of Chavez or a mayor from Caracas torn down the statue of Christopher Columbus and dragged the statue all over the city, you know, like the medieval times. They only were like in the horses. And they were dragging the statue of Christopher Columbus all around the city. So I said, I took note, you know, sign of resentment. And recently, the president of the Dominica, the island of Dominica, when he signed the ALBA treaty, he said that he was signing it in the memory of some Indians in the very far past that had been persecuted and had searched refuge in Honduras, and their descendants were in Honduras now. So they say that, but still I don't think that is really the original aggression event. I think that's rhetoric. And maybe more than rhetoric, there is a way, it's a tactic very much used by revolutionaries to unite the people in a common identity and to, to add to the cause for a revolt and all that, but I don't think that it fits the model. Anyway, the second thing I don't agree is that it is an incurable disease. I do believe that present contemporary psychology, especially cognitive psychology, will have much to say about this, at the individual psychological level. And I firmly believe that the social and political sciences and leadership studies has not only much to say about the question, but will have to offer positive propositions towards the understanding among human beings in society, and towards political redemption and peace. Maybe this is just wishful thinking, but I really want to believe that we can rescue our human faith. Thank you.
Questions, comments? There's that pause when you ask that.
I'm really interested in the inversion of values idea. And I don't know very much about Venezuela, but as I think about the world history that I know, I don't see very much of what you're describing. And actually, part of what's very interesting throughout your talk is your psychological assumptions about the way the unconscious works, and the idea that somehow the protests of the disadvantaged groups seep in somehow to the unconscious or the conscious of the rulers, and that they become guilty.
Seller's book.
There are certainly periods in history where that has not happened, where guilt does not happen, and I just wonder whether you think it happens very often, and thoughts about when it does and when it doesn't happen.
Well, according to Scheller and Nietzsche, it happened from 2,000 years ago until now. I mean, for Scheller, since the French Revolution. In Scheller, the thing is very complicated. He studies how industrialism has inverted values and humanitarianism. I mean, the basic idea is when they say to people that being poor is good, that's for Nietzsche. That suffering is good in Nietzsche. In Scheller, the thing is very, very complex because Scheller was objectivist, and he believed I would say even he was an essentialist. So the eidetic reduction of Scheller, which certainly applies Husserl's method, is he wants to find the essential values and a hierarchy of values that are fixed and absolute. And he thinks that modernity has inverted because the value is not the value itself, but they are mean values. They are not end values, but mean values. And consumer society, that's mean values, and people don't do things for themselves, but because they are means to other ends. And it's, I mean, almost the whole book, Scheller's book, is to demonstrate how modern society inverted values, and that's why we are decayed, because it's not good by itself, it's not love by itself, but love is a means to another end. But I'll tell you more practically what we've lived through, which is not so complex or so intellectual, but it's there. Almost, I don't remember, it was the first speech of Chavez after he was in power. He said very movingly that if his daughter was hungry, he would kill or rob for her. And then he understood that people had to rob and kill because the injustice, the rich people, the exploiters of the poor and of the workers. This was Sunday. On Thursday, I was mugged. And